And okay. There we go.
Okay, welcome back to the second portion of our webinar series today. It's on the census pulse surveys. I'm Erica Gardner, and I'm the Washington STC representative, and I am hosting this meeting with Charles Charles Reinerson from Oregon. We are very pleased to have Colin Shelvin, Catherine Bonney, and Jason Fields presenting today on both the Household Pulse and the Small Business Pulse. And we have Heidi Crawford and Barb LaFleur, also from the Census Bureau, assisting with the chat and other technical details. As with the first webinar, we would like you to put your questions in the chat, and we'll probably hold those till the end of each section. And there'll also be an opportunity to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. So with that, I will pass it off to, I think, Colin or Catherine.
Hey, thank you, Erica. My name is Catherine Bonney, and I am the project manager on the Small Business Pulse Survey. So let me see, here we go. And Colin Shevlin is the lead data analyst. He'll go through some of the Small Business Pulse data with you. And then Jason Fields will be joining from the demographic area to talk about the household pulse. So first slide here, 2 populations, 2 surveys. In March-ish 2020 timeframe, right after the pandemic was declared, the economic and demographic directorates rallied to try to figure out how can we measure the impact of the pandemic on the economy and households. And the Small Business Pulse and the Household Pulse Survey were born, if you will, and have been measuring the impact since in all of its ebbs and flows. So you can see here the timeline. April 26 is when we started. We started chatting about it at the end of March and was able to mobilize and get data collection going April 26. We partnered and still partner with the different agencies that I have listed here: the Small Business Administration, the Federal Reserve Board, ITA, Minority Business Development Administration, BEA, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So just kind of reading from this partners area here. And so every time we are considering content, we reach out to try to figure out what would be useful, what content that exists is currently being used, and considering new content as well. I'm going to let Jason cover the Household Pulse survey information later down the line. So I'm going to click to the next slide here. If you guys have, I'm open to questions throughout. If that, Erica, I don't know if that's how you guys normally do these, but if anybody has any questions.
We're open to that, if however it best works.
Sounds great. Okay, so Small Business Pulse overview. We leverage our existing business frame and infrastructure to create the survey in a rapid manner to get it operationalized. It was designed to measure the data in near real time, measuring the effects of the pandemic on small businesses. And as I previously mentioned, we partnered with other experts at federal agencies. And here's just a timeline of the different phases that we have. So we are currently conducting phase 6 right here, and then planning for a phase 7 to start up mid-November. This is just a summary slide here that shows, so what is a Small Business Pulse survey? Each questionnaire has consisted of around maybe 19 to 21 questions, relatively quick, subjective, discretionary survey, basically asking like, how has the pandemic impacted you? Have you had issues with shutting down? Have you had to close locations, open locations? Inquires about employees. We have a whole new section on new norms for that. I'm not going to dive too much into content because Colin has a slide on that later. We covered the partners here and the phases. So the methodology and collection, there's about a little less than 1 million in the sample representative of the 5.6 million small businesses, which this includes all single location businesses with 1 to 499 employees and 1,000 in revenue. And that also, we also had an email address for it. So this is collected solely through email. We send out a request to complete the survey on Monday and ask for a response by Thursday. We send a due date reminder on Wednesday, and then on Friday, we send another reminder, and the company actually has until the end of the phase to respond. So on that Friday notice, we say, please respond by the end of the date so that we can, end of the phase, to try to capture that information. Let's see what's interesting here. We have, I think I mentioned this, but we went from concept to data release in 39 days. It's the first economic survey conducted solely by email. We still have weekly data releases. And we have national estimates as well as state, top 50, MSA, metro areas, and sector detail, 3-digit. We use Centurion as the reporting tool, similar to most of our programs, and our response rate has been around 20 to 25% each week. And I think I'm handing this over to Colin now.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. So with each weekly publication, we try to provide data users all our data in 2 main ways. You know, our first one is with this super interactive, visualization heavy website, and through our prepackaged charts and maps, users can quickly gain insights into the story that the data is telling each week. All of our visualizations provide the ability to toggle between estimates at the national level or by 2-digit NAICS sector, state, MSA. Our visualization options include responses by geography and sector, where you can view how a single response category differs across state and sector. We also have a survey response detail where you can view the distribution of response categories for a single question. Multiple response comparison scatter plots allow the users to see correlations among response categories by state, sector, MSA. We also have a series of visualizations that look at multiple stat periods. So the survey response weekly comparison shows the entire time series of estimates for a single question, and the prior year comparison selects the target week and compares it to what the responses showed a year ago. If a user is not able to get exactly what they're looking for from our visualizations, we also provide the data files with even more granular estimates for download. So in addition to all the categories I discussed a little bit before, we also provide data at the 3-digit subsector level, data by employment size, and state by sector estimates. All right, next slide. So we talked a little bit about how we provide the data. I wanted to dive into the content that we collect and how it's changed over time to remain as relevant as possible. So like Kathy mentioned, before each phase, we go through, work with stakeholders, and find a selection of questions that are going to provide good information and not be overly burdensome on our respondents. So over the course of the 6 phases, questions have kind of fallen into a few high-level buckets. You know, we have our overall effect of the pandemic on their business, operations, questions that are asking about things like revenue and employment changes. In phase 6, we began asking about COVID-related requirements for employees to show up to work that week. And in the current phase, I think Kathy mentioned this before, that we introduced questions to measure how aspects of the business have changed from their pre-pandemic norms. We have also asked a variety of questions over the phases about business finances, and we always finish up the survey with 1 or more questions related to the business's future outlook. Next slide. So I put together a couple of slides just highlighting a subset of the content. It's certainly not an exhaustive list. I would really encourage everyone to head over to our website after this presentation and poke around for themselves. First up is our overall.
What is going on?
What do you think?
I don't know.
Do you want to put in?
Hey, Barb, can you mute yourself?
Hold on a second.
Okay. I was glad that what is going on was not directed at me. So
I am so sorry about that.
No worries. So this first one is looking at our overall effect question, and we're asking the business just generally, subjectively, how it's been affected by the pandemic. Respondents choose from 5 answer categories, ranging from, we've experienced this large negative effect to the less frequent large positive effect. And you can see how the responses at the national level have shifted away from that large negative category that we saw right as the pandemic was hitting, as businesses have started to figure out how to weather the storm. On the next slide, we show the different types of insights that a user can gain when looking at more detailed sector estimates. So these charts show what the previous week change in revenue and employment for both sector 72, which is accommodations and food services, and sector 52, which is finance and insurance. Clearly, the pandemic's not having a uniform effect across all sectors. And while we just saw the benefit of comparing sectors, users can do a similar analysis by comparing responses by state. So on the next slide, I mentioned before that we, in phase 4, started asking about businesses requiring their employees to either test negative for COVID before coming to work or be vaccinated before coming to work. And here's a side-by-side comparison of how those responses have shifted over the course of time for both New York on the left and Texas on the right. So again, we can see that responses are certainly not a monolith across states either. And I mentioned that in phase 6, we started asking about changes from pre-pandemic normals. I think that some of these data are super interesting, and the charts shown here show those responses at the national level. Really popping off the slide should be that there's been a decrease in employees and an increase in the prices that businesses are paying. And finally, I wanted to touch on one of our questions about what the business expects to need in the next 6 months. So this is in that future expectations bucket that I mentioned. And it's really interesting to see the shift over the course of the survey phases. Increasingly businesses are identifying or are remarking that they need to identify new employees and alternative supply chains rather than what were the most difficult aspects that they were facing, like trying to find financial assistance or having to pivot to increase marketing. And so thus far, we've just looked at our estimates for questions, and these, based off their nature, have non-numeric answers. But we also provide indexes, which are used to create that numeric representation of one or more questions that don't have a numeric answer. And the table on this slide shows our 4 current indexes that we provide and the questions that contribute to each. So the overall sentiment index assesses the overall effect of the pandemic on small businesses. The operational challenges index assesses the overall effect on business operations specifically. The market challenges index assesses the tightness in business conditions, and the expected recovery index summarizes the length of expected recovery. On the next slide, I have a time series here that's plotted for the overall sentiment index. And this should look pretty similar to the first chart that I showed with the diverging bar chart, where I had all of the categories displayed across time, but it might be more easy to digest when we only have a single numeric representation of those 5 answer categories, but it's still telling the same story. And data users are always going to want more, and an extremely common refrain that we've been hearing is, this data is really great, but do you have anything by X, Y, or Z? Quite often we're asked about ownership characteristics. And I'm really proud of our team of economists and math stats that, in response to these requests, have put out a variety of research papers and data products. So now on our Small Business Pulse survey website, we have a research tab that houses all of this, and specifically we have data files that have estimates by ownership characteristic and rural urban designations for phases 1 through 3. And, we're coming to the end of what I wanted to touch on, but I did want to highlight, Small Business Pulse was created in response to the pandemic, but it certainly, we're seeing extended benefits beyond that. There are so many discrete events that might get lost in our monthly or quarterly or certainly annual surveys that we're seeing the effects in the Small Business Pulse data. So, consider the recent hurricane that hit Louisiana. We can see what here is likely its effect showing up in the operational challenges index. And remember, that's the one that summarizes the revenue and employment type responses. So that drop in the yellow shaded area for Ida shows the decrease in employment and temporary closures, that type of thing. So really, it shows the promise of what these weekly programs are capable of. And that's all I have for the Small Business Pulse survey. The next 2 slides show some additional resources like contact information and useful links to our website. Kathy, if you have anything else to add, feel free, or we can just pass it on to Jason to discuss the Household Pulse survey. Or we can pause for questions. It's whatever works for everyone else.
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing here just for a moment. Jason, the link that I have pulled up doesn't have your slides in it. I'm not sure why, so I don't know if you want to just grab those really quick and bring them up while we answer some questions.
Yeah, let me do that. I'll just share from my screen.
Does anyone have any questions? You can type them in the chat or raise your hand.
So, Catherine, this is Heidi Crawford. I'm a data dissemination specialist out here in the Pacific Northwest that works with Charles, Erica, and Barb. So I know one of the questions that I get a lot from data users is the level of geography. Are you all going to be looking at possibly producing statistics at even, I think, even the place level in the future?
Heidi, at the establishment level, is that right?
Well, in terms of geography, place, so you've got what you produce at national, state, and MSA, but are you looking at producing anything at county or the place level?
Potentially in the future, when planning for what the Small Business Pulse might transition into, we are considering that lower level of detail and trying to work that into the sample. So a lot of those conversations are early on, and we're working through what it would look like.
One thing, though, with that is you have to consider we have these disclosure avoidance procedures, so it's a little bit easier to produce data at that fine of a level for demographic data because there are just more people than there are businesses. So that's certainly a balancing act that we have to weigh when considering these types of things.
Yes, I've talked to some of the economists, and they have shared the same thing. Some of it's balancing disclosure and also some of the margins of error too with the data.
Absolutely.
So we do have a question that came in. How often do folks get the surveys? And then can you discuss the danger of being email wary? Wouldn't we expect participation to wane over time?
Kathy, do you want to take that, or I can? It doesn't matter.
So the first part, I can take it. I was listening. The first part was, say that first part of the question again. Is it in? Oh, here it is. How often do folks
Sure.
take surveys?
I was thinking.
Okay. So How this survey is weekly for 9 weeks. So then if the respondent is included in the week 1, they would get it week 1, then 8 additional weeks would go in, and then there's a 4-week break. So then they would get it again. So Colin, how often is that they are getting, like if they're in week 1, that's like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, like 12-week break essentially.
Yeah, roughly it's once a quarter for a company.
And yes, we would expect that participation. Our response rates, we're still seeing around the same response rate, 20 to 25% since we started, but we are looking at refreshing the sample to give these folks a break.
Related to that, this is Erica. Can you put the response rate that you receive for the small business into context with other similar surveys?
Sure. I think I can't speak on the annuals. I think some of the other indicators that we have are probably around 50%. So certainly this being an experimental product, they and a weekly, they're lower, but that's built into then our sampling error that we publish.
And related to that, you know, so how do you wait for non-response and all of that?
So we have a detailed, neither Kathy nor I are math stats, but we have our methodology posted on the website. I would certainly direct you there. But I think in general, we have their sampling weight, and then we reweight based off the responses that we get.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, I think the formal calculations and things are found on the methodology tab.
Yeah, we have another question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Erica.
No, well, I was just, you know, it's a new survey and it's great to have the data turn around so quickly. I mean, that's fantastic. I'm just, you know, I'm still struggling, I guess, with understanding, you know, the response rates and how that impacts the data and then, you know, how to interpret it. So. There's no question there, but if you had anything to elaborate, that's one of the things that I struggle with.
No, and I think that it's probably you go ahead and interpret it the same way you would on a survey that has a 75% response rate. It's just whenever you're looking at that confidence interval around your estimate, it's going to be a little bit wider because there is more error built into that. More uncertainty built in.
And then we have another question. It says, I missed the first few minutes. Does the Small Business Pulse Survey have information on business permanent closures due to the pandemic?
We do have one of our future Outlook questions asks, in the next 6 months, do you, I don't have the wording up, but one of the answer buckets in the end of that is that this business has permanently closed. So you can go to that question answer combination to find that information.
And then, so Charles had a question. He says, I noticed that MSA data in the visualization are only for large MSAs. So example, Portland, Seattle, but not like Salem or Olympia. Are the codes for other MSAs included in the microdata?
So we only publish this, again, this ends up getting into your same sort of disclosure issues. So as you're getting to less and less populous MSAs, then you're just having a harder and harder time getting enough cell counts in there to publish estimates. So the decision was made at one point in the planning phases that we were only going to publish the top 50, but that's not to say that there aren't businesses from other areas that are making their way into the microdata and contributing to those national or state estimates.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions at the moment for the small business pulse survey data. So I guess if we want to go ahead and transition to the household pulse survey, we can.
Sounds good. Why don't I share my screen? You can let me know if this works. Has it come up?
Yes, we do see it.
It surely has.
Okay, great. So I'm Jason Fields. I'm in the Demographic Directorate in the Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics Division. There I'm a senior researcher for demographic programs and the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which is not the one we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about the Household Pulse. And just as a quick reminder, any opinions and conclusions are mine, not those of the Census Bureau. All right, let's go. There we go. Okay, so as you already know and you've heard a little bit about as we talked about the Small Business Pulse, February 2020, there was a lot going on, and in March, everything changed for us. So, you know, we were fully involved in Census 2020 operations. Our household surveys were separately dealing with declining response, maintaining data quality, developing ways to use administrative records, thinking about small area estimates and how we can generate those from our household survey collections. And we were, of course, moving forward with lots of different aspects of disclosure prevention and privacy protection, which are always under development at Census. But in the middle of March, COVID pretty much shut everything down. So all of our in-person field data collection stopped. Our mail center in Jeffersonville, Indiana, closed, and all the staff were sent home. Our telephone interviewing centers were closed, and the staff couldn't work in those kind of consolidated areas to use phone to reach respondents. Our field personnel that were doing the in-person interviews shifted to what we call decentralized telephone interviewing. So they took their laptops they would normally have taken to your house, and they sat in their house and worked through contact lists to try and continue collecting interviews. And of course, at this time, all of us at headquarters also shifted to full-time telework. Okay, so in addition to those things, you know, and creating new surveys like the Small Business Pulse and the Household Pulse, we also were recognizing and changing content on our existing surveys. So many of our surveys, like the Current Population Survey or the Survey of Income and Program Participation, changed content, but didn't change data collection cycles. They just tried to keep going by phone. But the Household Pulse survey was new. It was brand new from scratch, and it was designed to jump in and quickly, efficiently collect data on how people's lives were being impacted by the pandemic. We recognized, and kind of everybody had a gut check at the same time and said, we don't know what's going on right now, and we need a survey or data collection tool that is going to reach into households and help federal agencies understand how to best serve a population experiencing the pandemic. And to do that as quickly as possible and as transparently as possible. I'd like to point out that the Household Pulse Survey and a small business as well, but these are experimental data collections. They're basically started as proof of concepts. And for the household pulse, of course, we accept that this means that it doesn't meet our regular household survey data quality standards. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. What enabled the household pulse to even go into the field was that we had something called the contact frame. And it had been something in development for a while. It is essentially a listing by address ID, so our master address file ID, of emails and phone numbers that are connected with people at places, and they come from both our own data collections, where we ask people about their contact information, and from vendor files. And for the most recent contact frame, it actually one removed from the most recent, what we used when we started the household pulse, about 75% of the addresses that we would have interviewed in the country, that we would have considered in universe, had an email address. And about 62% had at least one cell phone number. And the combination of those two was about 81%. So the household pulse survey was not, of course, done by just the Census Bureau. It was a collaboration with lots of expertise from around the federal government, and that quickly expanded and somewhat, you're rewarded for your success by more work. So our initial partners, there were about 5 federal agencies plus the Office of Management and Budget that joined to help us align content with information needs, provided resources in terms of the cognitive testing labs at the National Center for Health Statistics and the Bureau of Labor Statistics joined Census to do expert review and review proposed questionnaire content and do so very quickly. But over the course of the next 18 months, we have expanded the list of agencies that we are providing information for up to about 15 or so. The average interview length also increased to what we think is pretty much a maximum of about 20 minutes for a self-administered in-person, in-household online questionnaire. Our response rate, and I know there were questions about the response rate for the small business pulse, but the household pulse also definitely has issues with the response. Phase 1 over here, you can see on the left, vary between 2 and 4% response rate. And I will put out there that there's a little bit of a caveat here, and the design of phase 1 was one that after we interviewed a household once, we included them in the outgoing sample to be interviewed a second time. And then if they answered the second time, they were in for a third time. What we learned during phase 1, during these 12 weeks, was that really significantly impacted response. We couldn't keep including them in sample like that, so we dropped that. As soon as we dropped that, 2 things happened. One, we expanded the data collection window from 6 days to be 13 days, and we added a set of reminders. And we only included households once per cycle. So they were included once, and then they were dropped until by random chance they came back again. So that corresponded to a bump in response starting with phase 2. And we've been between 6 and 7% pretty much ever since. Overall, through all of the phases, and these are marked by, the phase breaks are marked by 1, had a change in data collection period as well as expansion in content. Phase 2 to phase 3 was moving from an emergency clearance at the Office of Management and Budget to a regular clearance. Phase 3 and 3.1 and 3.2 mark changes in content. and expansions and contractions in some content. Overall, we've sampled about 40 million units, and we've collected over 3 million interviews over the course of now 18 to 19 months or so. And keeping in mind that the Household Pulse was originally only supposed to be a 12-week survey at most. So the content, this is the most recent content list. We ask questions in basic demographics. These are the only content that have any edits. The edits are done so that we have complete distributions for weighting. But other than that, there are no edits. So all of these content areas will have missing data, and you'll have to pay special attention to those as you use the data. We have sections, they're listed here for you: employment questions, food security questions, health questions, housing, and education questions. So really focusing on these domains of household life. Okay. We provide access to the data in a number of different ways. The data tables are micro data tables. They are in Excel format. They're up on the website. I'm not going to walk through them at the moment, but there's about 40 or 50 tables. They are accompanied by data tables that have the standard errors. So exactly the same as the estimates, but they contain the standard errors. And we highly recommend you use the standard errors so that you can understand the level of error around estimates that you might want to show. We also release the microdata directly in SAS and CSV format. Those public use files are available. And we have an interactive data tool, which I'm going to show you a screenshot or two of information from. And we've put up a COVID vaccination tracker, which we can talk about. I don't actually show it, but I'm happy to answer questions. In addition to that, our analysts at Census have done a number of different America Count stories to try and give you some context. So those are up and available from the Census Bureau newsroom. So this is an example of our data tool. It allows you to drill down in terms of geography or subject or time. This happens to be a week 33 image of food scarcity and shows you the national map. I did a mouse over and hovered over Louisiana, where you can see that the estimate is 17.4%. We show you the standard errors. So here, plus or minus 3.7%. And then in the right-hand side, you can look through all of the states and take a kind of a comparative look at the levels and the errors around estimates of food scarcity. The other subject matter content in the tool include those other major domains. So there's employment data, housing data, health data, all represented there. Mental health, and this is just a table that does about a year's worth of data from the first year of the pandemic. And this is particularly striking to me, and what you're looking at are the feelings of anxiousness, loss of interest in doing things. So the blue and the green line, the light blue line is feeling worry, or the kind of darker green is feeling down and depressed. So these are two measures each from the anxiety scale and the depression scale that are represented in the National Health Interview Survey. You can see that over the course of the pandemic, those did rise, and thankfully have begun to go down a bit as we closed out a year of being in the pandemic. But overall, in comparison to what they were from January to June of 2019, directly from the National Health Interview Survey, they are substantially higher. Another important thing to note here is that when I'm showing data from the Household Pulse, I usually show this break between phase 1 and phase 2.
When I was chatting with Jason prior to the meeting, he did say he was having a little bit of connection issues. Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
I can.
Catherine. Yeah, thanks. I was wondering if it was just me or a general issue, so thanks for chiming in.
Yes, of course.
Okay,
Oh.
I'm almost there. We're almost there. So,
Hey, Jason, we lost you
this-
for a brief second. Welcome back.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so this is just quickly, I was saying, in addition to states and the nation, the 15 largest metropolitan areas are represented in the household pulse data.
Looks like we lost him again.
Hmm.
Jason, you could try and cut your video of showing maybe yourself, if that would help, and just show the slides.
Yeah, sometimes that can be the trick.
Yeah.
Can you cut your video and see if that helps with our connection issues? Well, we'll wait a minute to see if he comes back.
Am I back on yet?
Yes, you are. We were
Okay.
thinking that maybe you could cut or present your slides, but cut your video and see if that improves.
Yeah, I can do that. Sure. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides again.
Yes.
Yes, we can, but we missed what you were saying on the prior slide.
Got it. All right.
Yes.
So yeah, so this slide is the, as it says, the households, adult percentages of adults in households with children under 18 where that household received the child tax credit. And you can see that there is some metropolitan MSA area variation in the receipt of the child tax credit. And I would encourage you to look at, of course, look at the standard errors, and other content does have, over the course of the data collection in the Pulse, has had substantial metro area differences, especially, for example, the changes in employment income, loss of employment, did affect areas different regionally. There we go. Okay, expected likelihood of eviction by emergency rental assistance. When you start to use the microdata, this is the type of thing that you can do. So across the bottom on the x-axis are your likelihood of reported likelihood of eviction. So whether you believe you're very likely, somewhat likely, not very likely, or not likely at all to be evicted. By the categories of the bars are whether or not you applied and received emergency rental assistance in the darker kind of periwinkle color, and through to the green color, which is my household did not apply. And this is kind of reassuring to households, to agencies that manage and promoted the energy rental assistance, emergency rental assistance, as a means to help secure people's housing. But also very concerning that the households that applied and waiting for a response, for example, felt that they were very likely to be evicted in the coming months. Similarly, for the household that was applied and denied, there's some real concern and tension. However, the households that did apply and receive it mostly felt that they were not very likely to be evicted in the next coming months. So again, some areas to and you know, I would say a note here: this universe is limited to households that are not current on rent. Okay, so all of these households are behind on rent in this graph. So that's something to kind of pay attention to, and something that you can do with the microdata itself. So what was the household pulse? Really, it was a stripped down version of a regular survey, but we did it faster and with a few new features, including access collection of data strictly through email and SMS text messaging. There is a place for low response experimental data collections like these, provided we can communicate enough caution and transparency in using the estimates. These data, again, are very limited, have very limited processing. You have to pay attention to missing data. You don't want to include all of the missing people that didn't answer a question in the denominator, for example. That would artificially lower your percentages. And that there's a significant need for rapid information sources, especially during these major events. And this work at the Census Bureau has highlighted maybe some gaps in staffing where we would need to fill that to support this on an ongoing basis now. What else? Where are we going? We really need to think about how to integrate this and meet additional geographic requirements. So we have other data sources, administrative data, contextual data from our other data sources, small area estimates. There are ways to use those estimation procedures to provide additional information that are updated on a rapid basis for small geographies. And I think that's an area where we're looking at developing. We also need to think about how to ensure that there's enough crossover data elements so that models will work based on linkages to the American Community Survey. And we need to acknowledge the fact that there is 19%, back to that original frame slide, that aren't represented in the frame because they don't have either email or cell phone coverage. So how do we get information that's representative for them? And to acknowledge that response differences among people, so differences in the characteristics of people who are responding to the household pulse and not responding, how do we ensure that that's represented properly in the data? And some links for resources for you. And I apologize for the connection difficulties.
Thank you, Jason. Does anyone have any questions? Looks like the first one. Why is data available from the top 15 metro areas as opposed to top 25 or some other metric like the largest metro area in each state?
The limitation really, and thank you, Peter, for the question. The limitation is really based on the population size of those areas and essentially the coefficient of variation that is acceptable. So it was purely a statistical decision at where the cutoff would be. You could, conceivably you could show, many more, but the standard errors would be so large as the data would be essentially unusable. So it's really a question of usability and access.
So here's the next. Oh, do you want to go, Heidi? Go.
Yes, sure. Is there potential to release data sets for large individual cities that span all waves of a single phase?
So absolutely. I would say so there's two pieces here. You can definitely use multiple waves, multiple cycles of the household pulse data together. I do that, and what you do is you essentially stack the cycles together, and you can divide the weights by the number that you stack together. So if you use 4 cycles of household pulse data, you can divide the weights by 4 and go forward. What that does for you, it doesn't add geography, but it increases power in the ability to look at breakdowns for smaller geographies. So even some states, but all of the MSAs would benefit from pooling across a couple cycles to make more stable estimates.
I don't see any more questions at the moment in the chat. And as a reminder, I just put in Catherine and Colin are also still on the line if you have any last questions about the small business pulse surveys as well.
So in the absence of other people having questions, I'll go ahead and, you alluded to the relatively low response rate with the household pulse. So what can you share with us about non-response and what you know, and then also just how I guess the household pulse is great to see where Washington is relative to, Florida or something like that. But what cautions would you, explicit cautions about what we shouldn't do with the data?
So, and I see that Wei Yin has a similar question about non-response, except that that's about item non-response, which I'll cover as well. So the household pulse does have a very low response rate. We've put out a non-response bias analysis, a first non-response bias analysis. There are others that will be coming, I believe. We're working on a couple. And what it shows you, so our respondents are more often higher educated, older, less minority, more often women than men. And during processing, the weighting adjustment uses the pop controls and rakes those back into line in addition to with education. What that does is it means that the national and state totals for race, gender, education are in alignment with what they should be. However, if there's some characteristic that is different for the respondents and non-respondents, and it's not captured in those weighting controls for education, age, race, sex, Hispanic origin, then that difference will still exist. One place where that showed up in the household pulse that we've been evaluating is in the proportion vaccinated. So if you've looked at the household pulse data, you'll see that our vaccination rates are much higher than what CDC has reported. There's clearly a relationship between responding to the household pulse and also being more likely to be vaccinated. What that does also mean is that, so as the weights are then applied by those characteristics, age, race, Hispanic origin, gender, education, it changes the distribution, but the underlying fact that the respondents are more often vaccinated than not gets magnified depending on how that distribution gets adjusted by the weighting. This is an area where there isn't currently a population control for vaccination. We don't know exactly, but the CDC data are better than the survey data in this respect. So as a survey methodologist, what I want to do is work on ways that we can make sure that we're trying to reach the population that is not being represented. So if you're not vaccinated, for example, maybe you're also not as likely to participate in a survey like this. Well, that helps us identify areas and populations that maybe need to have additional contact attempts, for example. So we're working on different ways to expand those resources to make sure that the data stay representative. As far as the non-response, if there's no bias like I just described, then the low response rate just implies that you'll have a bigger standard error. That's one of the reasons why the sample size is as large as it is that we can get enough cases back to increase power and provide some distribution for those more rare estimates. I think the place that I would encourage everyone to go is really to look at the source and accuracy statements, to understand the weighting, to understand how to calculate the variances. If you're using SAS, for example, we provide replicate weights, so you can really understand and incorporate that uncertainty in the estimates into your analyses. The question in the chat was about item non-response. When you have a distribution on a particular topic, likelihood of eviction as an example, and you have people that didn't answer it, so that broke off, didn't get to that question, you want to make sure that you take those responses out of the proportion that you would calculate. So you don't want all of those not answered to be counted as no, not likely to be evicted, right? They actually have a distribution amongst the not answered. You want to make sure that they are appropriately accounted for. So the distribution of likelihood of eviction is going to be more accurate if you exclude them. In our other household surveys, we allocate them. We impute them to have a response based on the distribution of the people responding. And Brian has a question about the API. Neither of these data sources are in the API, partly because they were so new and so quickly put together. And the API takes a lot of background information and stand-up time to get things into the API.
We still have time for maybe one additional question. Does anyone have a question for any of the speakers?
Hi, this is Wei Yan. I'd like to ask a follow-up question, if I can.
Yep.
This is still about the item non-response question. So I was trying to figure out whether there's some kind of a rough cutoff point when the item non-response reaches a certain point that you kind of start to lose the confidence in the specific item. For example, whether it's a 30% non-response or 40%, something like that, because once you reach a certain amount of non-response, item non-response, and you have to be sure that the item non-response does not represent the responses equally, meaning the distribution of the responses.
Yeah, so I would tell you, we put two different values in the variable. One is that the item was seen but not answered, and the other is that the item is not seen, if you're looking at the microdata. And those two have very different meanings. We have a high partial rate, so people that don't reach the end of the survey. Among the people that get at least a quarter of the way in, a third don't finish. Okay, so there are a number of breakoffs. So I would not worry as much about their non-response as I would about people that selectively didn't respond. So saw the item and didn't respond to it. So I think you should use the two different values and take those elements apart for the specific item you're looking at.
Thank you.
Last call, one last question. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for coming today. This has been incredibly helpful in understanding the small business pulse and the household pulse surveys. And along with Charles, I'd like to remind people of the upcoming event next Monday, October 4th, where we'll be doing redistricting, count question resolution, and SETSI MDAT training. Anything you'd like to add, Charles?
Yeah, just thank you to our presenters, and thank you to all people who hung in there and learned about the pulse surveys. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Charles and Erica and others for organizing this and for having us today. If you have any additional questions, we'd be happy to answer those via email. Thanks again.